Hello, this is going to be nervous system part 2, the anatomy part. So nervous system part 1, we talked about the membrane and the potential, and the parts of the neuron. And now we're going to talk about the parts of the brain and give you a basic idea about how it works. This is going to be a really basic one. I'm going to try to keep it short, and I will give you a little assignment at the end. So please have the assignment ready by the due date. So every time you move a muscle, every time you think a thought, your nerve cells are hard at work, processing information, receiving signals, deciding what to do, dispatching new messages. Some nerve cells communicate directly with muscle cells, sending them the signal to contract. Other nerve cells are solely in the bureaucracy of information. But unlike our human bureaucracy, this processing of information must be fast in order to keep up with the ever-changing demands of life. Okay, so, oops, forgot about shutting off the penguin noises. There we go. So we talked before about why they need a nervous system, and in the other video. So we have a few different things here. Oopsie, back you go. Central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, CNS, is brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is the sensory nerves, the nerves from the senses, and nerves to muscles. So they're the peripheral nerves, the nerves on the periphery of the body. So for example, down here, the tibial nerve is part of the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is only the spinal cord and brain. Okay, so this shows you the spinal cord being broken down into the three areas, cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. But what they really mean is that they're talking about the nerve roots that come off the spinal cord, which immediately become a part of the peripheral nerves because just the spinal cord and the brain are central. Okay, here's the structure of a neuron, which we talked about in the previous video, so I'm not going to go over that again. But just to remember that the signal direction is that the signal is received at the dendrites, and the signal direction is out along this direction along the axon to the synapse. And what covers this area here? Do you remember? Starts with an M. Myelin, very good. You're so smart. Okay, here we go. We talked about this before, so we're skipping this. I don't know why there's duplicates in between these two slides. Alright, so axons are coated with myelin to speed the signal along. It's a fatty substance. So the signal hops from node to node. 330 miles per hour versus 11 miles per hour. So without the myelin, it would go super slow. And diseases like MS, we said, of course, involve a decrease in the myelin. We can talk about a bunch of the big nerve diseases in class when we go do a follow-up on this. Okay, so there's the hopping signal along the myelin. Okay, so synapse is the junction between nerve cells. Right there. So there's this space between the end of one cell and the beginning of another. So at the dendrite here. And it's a definite gap. It's called the synaptic gaps, the synapse. So the first cell releases a chemical to trigger the next cell. So this is where drugs affect the nervous system. They affect how what gets transported, how it gets transported, and whether or not the message is received. And we talked about this slide a bit before too, talking about neurotransmitters. So this is just a review so we can get to the anatomy. So the types of neurons: sensory neurons for sensing, and interneurons, which are part of the brain and spinal cord, and motor neurons, which go to the muscles. So muscles, of course, need to have nerve innervation so that it can move. Your senses need to be loaded with nerves so that we can sense things and get messages to the brain. And then we need to transmit information all around the brain and up and down the spinal cord. Here's the human brain, and this is just the most basic way of thinking about the parts, but it's a good place to start. So the cerebral cortex here is a highly developed part of the brain. The cerebrum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So hypo, in this case, meaning below. So the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. And we've already talked about the hypothalamus in its relationship to the reproductive system. And then just below that is the pituitary gland. And I'll show you some better pictures of this in class as well. So here's the midbrain and the hindbrain, which includes the pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum. We're going to talk about what these parts do in a second, so I'm not going to do that here. But this would be a great slide to practice on, to pause and to practice labeling the parts so that you know where they are. And just to orient you, of course, this is where your forehead would be, and this is the back of you. All right, so we often talk about the lower brain, this lower part of the brain, as the primitive brain, part of the brain that was developed first in vertebrates with the brain structures. So the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the cerebellum are this lower brain, and so they're managing the automatic functions: breathing, heart, digestion, swallowing, and vomiting, as well as homeostasis and coordination of movement. So the cerebellum is the area that's really coordinating movement, and it's actually also involved in some of the coordination of language. But I can show you in class some simple ways that we can kind of look at how people's cerebellum functions. For example, if you held your hand out right now with your palm facing the ceiling and then quickly flipped it over so that your palm faced the floor and went back and forth like this as fast as you can, then that would show that you have a highly functioning cerebellum. If it a little bit into that it couldn't do it, well, then your cerebellum is not coordinating motions very well. Also, things like being able to button a shirt down the middle involves the cerebellum being able to coordinate motion and find the midline. And of course, doing something like buttoning your shirt involves a lot of your brain, but the coordinated movement is the cerebellum. One of the myths of the brain is that you only use 10% of it, which is totally not true. You use all of your brain. Do you use it all to all of its potential? Probably not. How could we? But we do need and use all of our brain. Okay, the higher brain is the cerebrum up there. Okay, so it's got two hemispheres. The left working the right side of the body and the right working the left side of the body. And even though we say that here, it's a heck of a lot more complicated than that, because only some things work that way. Certain things do not cross the spinal cord when they're traveling up the track. So if you can just put this idea kind of off to the side, and I'll explain it more in detail in class. Generally, they want you to kind of think about this, but any test that asked you that would be kind of lame, because it's a poor way of really thinking about this. And we'll talk about why in class. The corpus callosum is the connection between the two hemispheres, and that's super important. So people with issues in between the two hemispheres, with issues with the corpus callosum, have a lot of trouble coordinating a lot of parts of their life in their body and their brain. All right, so the basic division of work here. The left brain, the left hemisphere, is the logic side. Math, logic, vision, hearing, and language. Okay, when I was learning this at this basic level, I remembered L for left, L for logic, L for language. Okay, and also for fine motor control. The right hemisphere is the creative side, pattern recognition, spatial relationships, nonverbal ideas, emotions, and multitasking. So they kind of will say that people tend to be dominant on one hemisphere or the other, but even that is just not considered really the way it works. Both sides of the brain are always working together all the time. There is a division of how these things are organized in the cerebral cortex, but we need to use, for example, both sides of the brain for language. Okay, language is one of the most important and complex things that our brain does, and it involves a lot of parts of the brain, and it definitely involves left and right hemisphere in different ways. So there's the motor aspects of language, of moving your mouth and your tongue. There's the coordination of words. There's the storage of the memories of words. All of that involves both sides. Being able to write creatively, certainly more on the right side. All right, so here we're getting a little bit more detail. All right, so this is the lobes of the cerebrum: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Okay, and they're divided into these regions partially because of location, but also because of their arrangement. All right, so the frontal lobe is speech and control of emotions, planning. The frontal cortex is not done developing until your 20s, so that's part of why you're not so great at controlling your emotions or planning until you're a bit older. Temporal is part of smell and hearing, right? Your ears are on the side of your head. That's an easy way to remember it. And then the occipital is the visual cortex. That's where vision is processed. So your nerves from the front, from your eyeballs, come all the way back to here. They actually cross in the middle just to make it more confusing. Right, so the occipital is vision, and parietal is speech, taste, and reading. So as I said, language involves a bunch of different parts of the brain, so you can kind of see that. All right, so they also show you in the picture, here's kind of an area responsible for taste. Here's where we're getting some of the more of the senses. Here's another aspect of speech, of smell, of hearing, just to give you an idea. They've been discovering a lot more about this in much more detail because of functional MRIs. So now we can take pictures of people while they're doing things like reading or talking or playing music, and we can see which parts of their brain are active while they're doing these things. And so, you know, if some of you go to med school, by the time you go to med school, the way you learn about the brain will include tons of research from functional MRIs. The limbic system controls basic emotions, fear and anger. It's kind of considered part of still the primitive part of the brain. It's part of emotional bonding, emotional memory. So here is the hypothalamus, the thalamus. Okay, this part is helps orient touch. Just to orient you, there's the cerebrum. This part processes hearing. This part processes vision, taste, smell, olfactory bulb. So the limbic system, just to remember, that has to do with basic emotions. It doesn't actually involve every one of these parts, but it's really involving the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the olfactory bulb. Those are the main parts of the limbic system. So the olfactory bulb, the amygdala, and the hippocampus are the main parts. those structures interact with the sensory areas of the cortex and other of the higher brain centers. So they kind of mediate our primary emotions. Um, so the olfactory bulb, smelling, is highly associated with emotions and memory. It's the only sense that doesn't really go through the cortex for processing. So in other words, we don't smell what we think we smell. Smell is just a little bit more of a pure link to our emotions and our memories. So the limbic system is central to some of the behaviors such as nurturing our infants, emotional bonding to other individuals, and that's sort of more what mammals have that reptiles and amphibians don't. The limbic system forms early in adolescence, and that provides a foundation for later in life. So we're born with brain circuits prepared to recognize faces, and that enables us to build more of a dependence and a relationship with our caregiver. We're very good at seeing faces first. That's one of the first things that we're able to do with our eyes and our brain as infants. So everything we learn sort of becomes a part and attached to the limbic system as we grow. So emotional memory is also really important. We remember how we feel. We attach emotions to our events. We learn to avoid situations that we don't want to get into again. And the amygdala is highly involved with that. Okay, a reflex or an automatic response. So we have many reflexes throughout our bodies. I will try to remember to bring in the reflex hammer, and we can do this maybe after the AP exam, just so you can have some time to really experience it. So when you hit a tendon, the tendon that's between your patella right here, the bone on your knee, there's a little soft spot there, the tendon, that attaches that little piece of bone onto your shin there, your tibia. So you hit that, and a normal reaction is to swing outward kind of at a particular sort of speed. So if it's too little reaction or too much of a reaction, that gives us valuable information. So reflex testing is an important part of any exam, and it's a big part of neurological exams. So they're trying to show you sort of the pathway from this event into the spinal cord. So we're affecting some receptors and sending a message up a neuron to the cell body of a dorsal root ganglion. This is a part of the spinal nerve. And this is going to go into a part of the spinal cord, okay? And then the message is going to be sent up to the brain. The brain is going to send a message back. It's going to travel along this side, the motor neuron, serving the quadriceps, and so the quadriceps respond by a kick. Now, my 9th grade biology book said that the brain was not involved in a spinal reflex at all, but it definitely is. So if a person has too brisk a response, then there's an issue with their brain being able to restrict that movement or inhibit an abnormal movement. If this is too slow, it could mean that there's an injury to the nerve or spinal cord at this level. And so this is showing you the difference too between sensory and motor neurons. And then here, interneurons, connecting ideas and neurotransmitters between neurons that are just in the spinal cord. Okay, so that message can go up a particular tract all the way up to the brain, but it's also going to be sending out a motor neuron reaction to cause movement. So we sense things, Sensory neuron goes to the spinal cord, goes up a tract to the brain. Motor neuron comes from the spinal cord, innervates the muscle, and the muscle moves. And that's a reflex. Okay, so it's a rapid response, automated. Signal only goes to spinal cord, no higher level processing. So this is just like the other book saying that there's no higher level processing. And while that's true, your brain has an effect on your reflexes. So your brain inhibits abnormal motions of reflexes. If there's something wrong with that inhibition part of your brain, you're going to have hyperreflexes. Your brain does not decide to move your leg. Your brain is just serving to inhibit any abnormal motions. The advantage is that, well, it's saying that you don't need to think or make decisions about it. I think that's kind of a lame way of saying it. It's just that reflexes are an easy way to evaluate the body, but you are built to respond without having to think. Okay, blinking is another example that you don't need to decide, it's just happening and it's good for you, as well as balance and pupil dilation and your startle response. Now, you can argue that your brain does not process, no higher level processing for any of these. However, if there's an issue in your brain, it's going to affect all of these. Okay, any questions? I told you this one was short. This is not sufficient probably for everything you need to know if you've looked at the chapters on this, but I would like us to just go over the chapters a bit more in class. So what do I want you to do for homework? Well, that's going to be on the very next slide. Hang on. So here's the basic stuff I want you to do. Draw and label a neuron if you haven't done so already. List the major functions of brainstem, cerebellum, diencephalon, circadian rhythms, cerebrum. Obviously, this is not a part, but I just think it's an interesting thing to look up. This is just sort of the middle of chapter 48. So if you haven't spent time learning about structure and function of the brain, I want you to review that section of 48. Chapter 48. It's a real short quiz. Short chapter. Explain an action potential, and then I want you to do the self-quiz and be ready to discuss. I'd like us to spend about a half an hour, 40 minutes in class going over the nervous system, but I really need you to study it up front for us to do so. So I hope this was a good video, nice and short, and good night.